Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack one of the most fascinating and honestly foundational documents in modern history, the Constitution of India. You know, we often think of a constitution as just some dense, dusty legal rulebook, but it's really so much more than that. Think of it as a grand social contract. It's a carefully negotiated agreement between the citizen and the state that details exactly what we owe each other. So, let's explore the blueprint of the world's largest democracy.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To make sense of this massive blueprint, we're going to break it down into 6 clear, manageable chunks. We'll hit the preamble and its vision, the basic structure doctrine, fundamental rights, directive principles, fundamental duties, and finally, the Union and its territory.
Starting us off, Section 1, the Preamble and the Constitutional Vision.
So think of the preamble as the ultimate mission statement of this nation's blueprint. It sets the tone, and it establishes the fundamental values for absolutely everything that follows. Right from those iconic opening words, "We, the people." That phrase immediately establishes that all the power ultimately comes from the citizens. Now, here's a really interesting piece of historical trivia for you. The words socialist, secular, and the word integrity, which pops up later in the text, they weren't actually in the original 1950 document. They were added years later, during the period of the emergency, by the 42nd Amendment Act in 1976. But regardless of exactly when they were added, these words beautifully outline the overarching goals of securing justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity for every single citizen.
Now, you might be wondering, and this brings us to a massively high-stakes question. If the Parliament is acting on behalf of we the people, does it have unlimited power to change these foundational rules? Like, could a government that happens to have a huge majority just come in, rewrite the entire Constitution, and fundamentally change the nature of the Republic? Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, the basic structure doctrine and the limits of power.
That massive question we just asked, it actually sparked some of the most intense legal drama in India's entire history. We are talking about a true tug-of-war between Parliament's power to amend laws and the Supreme Court's power to protect the Constitution. Let's see how this builds. Back in the 1967 Golaknath case, the Supreme Court basically ruled that fundamental rights were totally beyond the reach of Parliament. Parliament immediately shot back by passing amendments saying, actually, we can change anything. This historical thriller culminated in the landmark 1973 Kesavananda Bharati case. In a razor-thin 7-6 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that yes, Parliament does have wide powers to amend Constitution, but it absolutely cannot alter or destroy its basic structure. This tension peaked yet again during the 1975 emergency, when the 42nd Amendment tried to just wipe out all limits on Parliament's amending power. But in the 1980 Minerva Mills case, the Supreme Court struck that down too, reaffirming that having a limited amending power is in itself a part of that basic structure. Okay, so what exactly is this basic structure? Well, the court hasn't actually given us a single, exhaustive master list. They decided it's better to figure it out on a case-by-case basis. But they have identified core, load-bearing walls that absolutely cannot be knocked down under Article 368. We're talking about things like the supremacy of the Constitution itself, the democratic and sovereign nature of the Republic, the separation of powers, the total independence of the judiciary, and what's known as the Golden Triangle of fundamental rights, which are equality, freedoms, and the protection of life and personal liberty found in Articles 14, 19, and 21. Essentially, Parliament can remodel the House, sure, but they cannot destroy the foundation.
Moving on to Section 3, guaranteeing fundamental rights, or the citizen's interior space.
Let's shift the focus directly to you, the citizen. What personal liberties do you actually get out of this social contract? Well, today, there are exactly 6 fundamental rights guaranteed to citizens. These act as the Magna Carta of the Indian Constitution. Now, originally there were 7, but the right to property was actually bumped off this list by the 44th Amendment in 1978 and turned into just a standard legal right. So the remaining 6 cover your equality, freedom, protection against exploitation, freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, and crucially, your right to constitutional remedies. The absolutely crucial concept to grasp here is that these rights are justiciable. Found in Articles 12 through 35, these are your personal, legally enforceable rights. If the state violates them, it is punishable by law, and you can literally march into court for their enforcement. Now, to be fair, they aren't absolute. The government can impose reasonable restrictions, and they can even be suspended during a national emergency. However, and this is a massive exception, the rights guaranteed under Articles 20 and 21, that's your protection regarding conviction for offenses and your protection of life and personal liberty, those can never be suspended, not even during an emergency. No way. Which brings us to Section 4,
Directive Principles of State Policy, Exploring the Government's Objectives.
So, while your rights protect you from the state, what is the state actually supposed to be doing all day? This brilliantly illustrates the tightrope walk the Constitution pulls off. Fundamental rights, which were largely borrowed from the USA, act as strict boundaries for the state. They are justiciable, and they establish political democracy. On the flip side, we have the directive principles, which were borrowed from Ireland. These are broad, overarching guidelines for building a welfare state. They are designed to establish economic and social democracy. The catch? They are non-justiciable, meaning you can't just sue the government for failing to give you adequate livelihood or equal pay, but they are still absolutely fundamental when it comes to the actual governance and policymaking of the country.
Right, so you have your guaranteed rights, and the state has its directive guidelines. But what about your end of the bargain? Have you ever thought about the civic rent that's expected from you just for living in and benefiting from this democracy?
That brings us to Section 5, Fundamental Duties, the Citizen's Obligations. Now, what's really fascinating here is that these duties weren't even in the original Constitution. Inspired by the USSR, they were added later, in 1976 during the emergency, based on the recommendation of the Sworn Singh Committee. We started with 10, but an 11th was added by the 86th Amendment in 2002, which specifically obligated parents to provide educational opportunities to kids between 6 and 14. These duties ask us to do things like respect national symbols, protect the environment, and develop a scientific temper. But keep in mind, much like the directive principles we just talked about, these duties are non-justiciable. You won't go to jail just for lacking a scientific temper. They aren't legally punishable unless Parliament passes a specific law, like Environmental Protection Acts or laws preventing insults to national honor, to actually enforce them.
Let's look at Section 6, the Union and its territory, the physical boundaries.
So we know the contract, we know our rights, and we know our duties. But where exactly on a map does this social contract apply? For that, we look at Part 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 plainly states that India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. Notice that wording. Even though the Constitution is federal in its structure, dividing administration into different states, it very deliberately uses the word union. So the crucial takeaway is this. Unlike the American Federation, which was essentially born from an agreement among independent states, the Indian Federation is completely indestructible. The country is one integral whole. No state has the right to just secede or break away from the union.
And there is a very critical geographical nuance here that's important to grasp. You'll often hear the terms Union of India and Territory of India tossed around, but legally they mean very different things. The Union of India is exclusive. It includes only the states. Those are the entities actually sharing federal power with the central government. The Territory of India, on the other hand, is a much wider expression. It includes all the states, sure, but it also sweeps in all the union territories and literally any other external territories that the government of India might acquire at some point in the future. It's the whole shebang.
As you've seen today, the Constitution is this brilliant, incredibly intricate blueprint. It's constantly balancing the massive powers of the state against that unalterable basic structure, and weighing your fundamental rights right alongside your fundamental duties. I want to leave you with this final thought. This Constitution is not just some old historical document. It's a living, breathing contract, and it relies heavily on you. As a citizen in this indestructible union, how are you going to balance demanding your rights with fulfilling your duties to the nation? Think about that for a bit, because whether you realize it or not, you are an active participant in the ongoing story of Indian polity. Thanks so much for watching this explainer, and keep exploring.